Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Open the door immediately. We know what you're doing in there. Her husband broke down the door, his mother-in-law smirking as she followed him in, but the sight that greeted them inside quickly wiped the smile off her face. Cold sweat broke out on both of them. Carlos had just managed to snatch the last loaf of bread, forgotten on the shelf until late evening, and grinned with satisfaction. He made it. He grabbed it. Now his wife wouldn't greet him at the door with a sour face for being late coming home from work and for stopping by the supermarket last minute to get everything for dinner. Although, who knows what other grievances Julia might have against him. The amount of baseless dissatisfaction she unloaded on him daily seemed like it might someday grow into a tsunami. Yet he endured it all. He didn't want to argue with her, and he also felt sorry for his mother, who had to witness all this, so he put up with his wife. First of all, Julia didn't like that he stayed late at work. As Carlos's mother would say, if you like spending your husband's money, you should tolerate the ways he earns it. Carlos worked as a delivery driver, so he often had to travel to different towns and rural areas. It was hard to predict exactly when he'd be back home. Carlos understood that Julia was angry and said she hardly saw him, but what could he do? He needed to earn money. He always tried his best to hurry home. His mother could vouch for that. By the way, his mother's presence in their married life also caused Julia plenty of irritation. For some reason, the young wife believed that as soon as Carlos signed the marriage certificate, his mother, with her beautiful name, Rosa Morales, should have disappeared from their lives altogether. Carlos had been raised by his mother alone after his father had heartlessly abandoned them. He couldn't even imagine leaving his mother alone, not even in his worst nightmares. Besides, his mother wasn't that much of a burden. Julia, still not fully skilled in running a household, could have learned a lot from Rosa: how to cook, how to clean, how to take care of her husband's clothes. Instead of picking up such useful skills, Julia pouted and constantly hinted that Rosa didn't belong in the love nest of newlyweds. What kind of silly wife had he ended up with? "Don't worry, son, we'll set your Julia straight in no time," his mother would say, and Carlos really wanted to believe that. After all, he held all the reins in the family. Julia didn't earn much, she hardly had any work experience, and most of the family's income came from Carlos. So he managed the money as he saw fit. He even did the grocery shopping himself, despite Julia's complaints about it. She should have been happy that he took care of all the family's needs. All you have to do is open the fridge, take what your husband thoughtfully brought home, and cook. If you don't know how, my mother will show you. Instead of complaining, you should think about how to show gratitude to your husband and his mother. These were the thoughts swirling in the head of 37-year-old Carlos as he stepped out of the supermarket into the snowy evening, carrying a big shopping bag. He and Julia had been married for only a few months, and they were still going through that famous adjustment period, but Carlos believed everything would settle down. You just had to want to make it work and ignore the young wife's countless whims. As his mother would say, she'll smarten up and calm down. Meanwhile, not far away in a small room of a typical apartment, a young and pretty woman sat sadly by a window, sealed tightly for the winter. Though it was hard to call her a woman, her delicate facial features, unruly curls by her temples, and a childlike puffiness in her cheeks made her look more like an awkward teenager than a woman who had gotten married just months ago. Young, inexperienced, and very modest, Julia endured Rosa's constant hovering and reminders that she was now a married woman and had corresponding duties. Instead of showing gratitude for Carlos taking such a plucked chicken of a wife, as Rosa called her, Julia even dared to show her temper. Were there no decent girls left in the world, or had Carlos been blind and deaf when he dragged this scrawny, age-uncertain girl to the registrar's office? Yet Julia didn't bear a grudge against her mother-in-law. Sometimes she felt hurt and wished someone would stand up for her against Carlos, but then she would understand. After all, Rosa wasn't her mother and had no obligation to take her side. It was enough that Rosa agreed to let them live in her apartment. Rosa didn't do anything too bad, just grumbled a little and then calmed down. If only Carlos were as harmless as his mother, that would have been wonderful. Julia had grown up under strict control and couldn't imagine life being any different. Her authoritarian father, who was a final authority figure at work, carried the same bossy demeanor home. He didn't drink or smoke and had no bad habits, except for one major flaw: he wanted to control everything personally. He trusted no one and believed he would inevitably be deceived, even if by accident. As a result, Julia and her mother lived under an iron grip for as long as Julia could remember. "Still, dear, your father is a good man," her gentle mother would tell her, brushing Julia's long golden locks. "Just look at your classmates. Everyone knows that Katerina already had an abortion at 15. Miguel and Diego are registered at the juvenile office. Is that a good thing? They didn't even finish the 10th grade and are already on record. So don't be angry with your father, Julia. He only wants what's best for you." Perhaps her father truly wished her well, but Julia didn't understand it then and couldn't understand it now. Total control over her grades, her comings and goings. She couldn't even stay late at the library without warning her strict father, and even if she warned him, she risked him showing up at the door. She had never stayed over at a friend's house. Her father forbade even the thought and insisted she study instead of fooling around. She wasn't allowed to go to dances because, according to her father, there would be plenty of time for that later. "My task is to raise you as a worthy member of society," her father would say, and Julia had no choice but to obey. One of his main requirements was academic excellence. Julia wasn't allowed to bring home anything less than top marks. From 1st to 11th grade, she was a straight A student and the pride of her school. It was no surprise that when, at graduation, the headmistress proudly handed Julia her medal, she said, "We thank Julia Ramirez's parents for their constant involvement in their daughter's education." Julia stood there, barely alive, afraid to lift her eyes to her father. Sure, everyone smiled and applauded, but no one knew the demands he made, how he forced her to rewrite assignments and solve extra problems to prepare for exams. Her classmates had entirely different fathers, and their lives were much easier, while Julia, trembling, would drag her feet home after school if she got a bad grade. At least now it was all behind her. She had her diploma and a whole new adult life ahead. Her mother didn't want her to leave for the big city for university, believing she could settle for a local technical college. Her father agreed and even had a justification for keeping her under his roof. "You're too naive and, forgive me, a bit dim-witted. I have a feeling that the first scoundrel who crooks his finger at you will have you following him like a puppy. And who will clean up the mess?" Her father loomed over her like a mountain of flesh and bone, and Julia was terrified. Probably for the first time in her life, she dared to oppose him openly. "Dad, I believe in myself. I can handle it. I really want to get a higher education and work in the city." Defying her father was unthinkable, but Julia managed to break free. She waited until her father left for his shift, took the money her mother had secretly given her, kissed her goodbye, and headed to the bus station to go to the city. One could only imagine the scene that unfolded that evening and the harsh words her father had for her mother. But it was all in the past. Ahead was Julia's future. Julia was lucky to get into university on her first try, although it wasn't really luck but the result of her hard work. The money her mother had given her was enough to rent a room until she got a dormitory placement and could calmly focus on her exams. She didn't even dare call home and would reject any calls from her father's number. The mere thought of returning to her hometown and enduring his lectures again was horrifying. No, she would grit her teeth, persevere, and sooner or later make her dream come true. Studying and living in the big city turned out to be nothing like what Julia had imagined since early childhood. Perhaps something inside her had broken under the weight of her father's control, or perhaps she was just unlucky, but she barely scraped through her first semester. Studying without her father constantly breathing down her neck was much harder than she thought, especially in a city with so many temptations for a young woman. However, by her second year, Julia got serious about her studies after realizing she could easily be expelled. The girls who hadn't been able to pull themselves together had already said goodbye to the university, while Julia gritted her teeth and kept studying. Young, attractive, slim, and lively, Julia felt like she had stepped into a magical fairy tale land. There were so many wonders she had never seen in her hometown, and it all seemed made for her. Contrary to her father's dire predictions, she didn't fall into bad company. She understood that although plenty of boys swirled around her, they had their own interests, and she had her own goals to achieve. Julia learned to turn down unsuitable suitors and diligently kept chiseling away at the granite of knowledge. She met Carlos in a large, noisy cafe where one of her classmates was celebrating her birthday. Needless to say, Julia arrived dressed to impress. If her father had seen what his daughter wore to an eatery, she probably wouldn't have been able to sit down comfortably for a couple of weeks. But her strict parent wasn't there. Instead, there was a radical miniskirt and a low-cut blouse. Along with juice and soda, there was, of course, alcohol on the table, and a few male classmates were also present. At first, it was just a friendly gathering, but then Julia realized one of the boys was getting handsy, trying to slip his hand under her skirt. "Wait, what are you doing?" "Stop it," she started pushing his hands away. "I said no. Leave me alone." "Come on, don't be so coy," the boy whispered in her ear, his breath reeking of alcohol. "You act like you never rolled around in the haystacks back in your village." At that moment, memories flashed through Julia's mind, her father looming over her, shouting, "Be home by 9, I don't care if it's a birthday or whatever. I don't care about graduation parties either. Home by 9 or I'll tan your hide." There had never been any haystack adventures for her. At home, she was practically under guard. The boy's slippery hands were already achieving their goal when Julia, terrified, screamed. She didn't scream anything coherent, just a shriek of pure fear. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" a voice thundered above her head. For a second, Julia thought her father had somehow appeared out of nowhere. She instinctively braced herself for a scolding, but the next second, she realized she was wrong. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood over them, and the boy, realizing the situation had changed, quickly backed off and disappeared. "I take it this jerk overstepped his bounds?" The man smiled warmly and sat down beside her. "Nice to meet you. I'm Carlos." That night marked the beginning of their story. Carlos was, of course, much older, 17 years her senior, no small thing. But Julia quickly realized she felt safe and comfortable with him. He was experienced, smart, considerate, he knew what to say to her and how to motivate her. Sometimes, to Julia, he did go overboard, reminding her a bit too much of her own unforgettable father. But overall, he was the only one who cared for her in the big city. They dated for only 4 months before Carlos proposed. "I believe marriages are made in heaven, and you don't need half a lifetime to realize you're right for me," he said, gently holding Julia's wrists. Julia loved that Carlos took care of her. From the start, he set things up so that, since he was older and a man, it wasn't inappropriate for him to know where she was going, with whom, and until what time. Carlos subtly controlled whom Julia talked to, who she was friends with, and how she spent her free time, though there wasn't much free time. If he could, he would immediately come to see her, and they would be together. He worried if she wore a warm hat in the cold or if she soaked her feet in the rain. "I'm not a little girl," Julia would laugh. "It's my duty to worry about and take care of you," Carlos would reply. "And you should try not to give me too much reason to worry. Why are you wearing that silly light jacket again? How many times do I have to tell you, if it's cold, don't show off and catch the eyes of boys? Wear your long, warm coat. I don't want to see you dragging around in that rag again." Julia convinced herself this was just his way of showing care and concern. He didn't want her to get sick. So all the frivolous outfits quietly disappeared from her wardrobe. She enjoyed pleasing Carlos. So when he proposed, saying she was happy would be an understatement. She was also terrified that if her father found out about her relationship with an older man, there would be hell to pay. But if Carlos was proposing marriage, then he was no longer just a boyfriend, he was a fiancé, and that allowed a different level of closeness. With a fiancé, everything was permitted, her father would have no grounds to object. Julia kept her relationship with her parents very superficial. Her father had never forgiven her for defying him and leaving. However, over the past 6 months, his health had started to decline, with chronic ailments flaring up, and, according to her mother, he had noticeably softened. So when their prodigal daughter announced she was getting married and invited her parents to the wedding, her father didn't curse her out, he even agreed to come. Although he eyed her new fiancé with clear suspicion, and his look promised nothing good for Carlos. Julia had to exert tremendous effort to keep her father and her young husband apart throughout the ceremony, otherwise a major confrontation would have been inevitable. "You found yourself an old man who's going to bend you over his knee," her father said grimly when they were alone. "Remember, Julia, I didn't push you into marriage, and you have no way back home. We won't be shamed in our town because of you." "Dad, I'm not coming back because Carlos and I love each other," Julia patiently explained, though inside she was trembling. What if he told her to pack up and come home? He was stubborn enough to demand it. But he didn't. Before he left for their hometown, he repeated that she was permanently barred from returning because she had chosen university and marriage over the life she was supposed to have. She had, in his eyes, committed a crime of disobedience. "You'll find no happiness with that man," he said by way of farewell. "Just make sure he doesn't start beating you." Not exactly an inspiring blessing. Julia had to fight the urge to laugh. Sure, Carlos was strict, a seasoned man next to her young, fragile self, but the one thing he would never do was raise his hand to her. Carlos came from a respectable family. His mother was calm and dignified. It was hard to imagine him beating his wife. "Dad, Carlos and I will be fine," Julia whispered, not for her father to hear, but for herself. To her surprise, however, the first thing marriage cost her was her university studies. Rosa pursed her lips primly whenever Julia mentioned going to classes. "Respectable married women, my dear girl, first and foremost ensure their husbands are comfortable and happy," she lectured sweetly. "If you wanted a degree, you should have studied instead of batting your eyelashes. Now that a man has chosen you, it's your duty to live up to the title of wife." If Julia tried to resist or even shed a tear in front of her husband, the response was firm. "Tell me, did your mother have a diploma while she kept house and raised you? No? Then quit crying and trying to guilt-trip me and Carlos. If you've chosen marriage, then either keep house or bring in money. There's no third option, Julia. No third option, so be it." Julia took a leave of absence from university, though she lied to Carlos, claiming she had withdrawn completely. It was hard for her to give up her dream of earning that long-desired diploma. Carlos got her a job at his office, a menial position, more like a secretary, fetch and carry. Now it was called an office manager, but that didn't change the nature of the work. What else could Julia do without a degree? Still, she brought her own money into the family now, a point of pride for her. Julia felt like she was flying. Rosa highly approved that her daughter-in-law was no longer, as she once put it, a weight around Carlos's neck. "That's right, Julia," Rosa cooed. "You'll make a good wife once I properly teach you everything. Now let's start learning how to manage a household." Julia had always considered herself fairly capable when it came to cooking and cleaning. You couldn't slack off with a father like hers. She remembered how her father would wipe the baseboards and windowsills with a white handkerchief to inspect her cleaning, or how he would storm into the kitchen to check if she had tied her hair up before starting to cook soup. But Rosa wasn't satisfied with the skills Julia had brought from her parents' home. "You peel potatoes terribly," Rosa pointed out right away. "Look how thick the skin you leave is. My son will have to work just to supply the vegetable stall downstairs if you keep wasting food like that. And why are you throwing the chicken you boiled for broth back into the pot? You're supposed to take it out, shred it, and make a second dish with the meat. Have we really ended up with such a wasteful daughter-in-law?" Julia could only shrug. Sure, her family hadn't been rich, but they hadn't tried to stretch one piece of meat into 22 dishes and a compote either. "My mother taught me that way," she squeaked timidly. "Don't talk back to your elders when they're trying to teach you something," Rosa snapped out of the blue. "I'm doing you a favor so Carlos won't have reason to reproach you, and you're paying me back with black ingratitude?" The poor girl didn't understand what she had done wrong. She hadn't been rude, hadn't answered back, hadn't even raised her voice. But that evening, when Carlos came home and ate dinner, Rosa wasted no time in reporting the incident to her son, insisting that he take action. "I brought you into my home, and you're rude to my mother?" Carlos spoke very quietly, but the sound of his voice made Julia want to crawl into a hole. "A peasant girl, that's what you are." No one had ever insulted Julia like that before. She tried to defend herself, to explain what had really happened and that she hadn't meant any harm. "I believe my mother," Carlos cut her off. "I can't believe you yet. This time, you're lucky, we'll forget it happened. But if my mother ever tells me again that you're disrespectful to her, you'll regret you were ever born." Within minutes, Carlos seemed to have forgotten the quarrel and everything went back to normal, but Julia was in a stupor, unable to recover from his harsh and cold words. Had he just threatened her? Her Carlos, her loving, caring man? "Come on, sweetheart, don't pout." Carlos poked her playfully in the side, and Julia jumped in surprise. "You don't think I'll let you mistreat my mother, do you?" "I didn't mistreat her," Julia said through tears. "There you go again." Carlos frowned, and Julia could see he was genuinely displeased. "We've already discussed this. Stop pretending to be innocent. I trust my mother. Just do as she says, and everything will be fine. Got it? You're a smart girl, you know how to listen." His words sounded like a threat, but Julia chose not to notice. Life continued, with its ups and downs. Gradually, Carlos, sometimes with kindness, sometimes with manipulation, and sometimes with blunt ultimatums, isolated Julia from all her friends, both the ones she had made at university and those from her hometown. "What does a married woman need friends for?" Rosa would grumble. And if Julia tried to discuss it with her husband, he would echo, "The best friend for a wife is her pillow." That's that, my dear. Carlos was even more direct. If you're married, your only concern should be your husband and your relationship with him. I know you're silly little friends, always chasing after richer men. Is that what you want too? Carlos looked so hurt that Julia would immediately hug him, press herself against him, and swear she would never, ever trade him for another man. If you don't need another man, then you don't need girlfriends either, he would conclude. If you have too much free time, better to clean something or cook something special. It was always the same. Whenever Julia dared to dream a little, Carlos would quickly remind her that her main function as a wife was household chores, not living a carefree, happy life. But that was just the beginning. About a month ago, after receiving her paycheck, Julia couldn't resist the temptation to stop by a nice clothing store and buy some new clothes, both for herself and for Carlos. The Black Friday discounts were too good to pass up. She even picked out something for Rosa, mostly to avoid her scolding. But things turned out differently. As soon as Julia showed her purchases, a storm of indignation rained down on her. "Do you think it's okay to waste money on this nonsense?" Rosa exclaimed, waving the shawl Julia had bought for her as if it were a poisonous snake. "My son works day and night to bring money home, and you spend it like this?" Julia couldn't understand why an inexpensive shawl could cause such outrage. But Rosa was even more offended by the clothes Julia had bought for herself. "Who are you trying to impress in that dress?" "I bought it to look nice for Carlos," Julia said, her voice trembling. She knew even answering back could get her scolded for lacking proper respect. "A husband should be impressed by your deeds, not by the rags you drape on yourself like some hussy," Rosa yelled. "And what did you get for Carlos?" The nice, soft gray sweater was flung onto the floor. "I dressed my son like a real man, and you bring him garbage he should be ashamed to wear outside. Just admit you're trying to turn him into some whipped fool who wears whatever his wife picks out, cheap, low-grade junk." Julia was stunned at how masterfully Rosa twisted her good intentions into something vile. Needless to say, after this incident, Julia's paycheck card ended up in Carlos's wallet. "It's better this way," Carlos lectured her. "You won't be upsetting my mother anymore. She's the dearest person in the world to me. Don't take it personally, Julia, but I won't let you send my mother to an early grave with your antics." Julia had to submit. Not only had she given up her bank card, but now she had to ask Carlos for money even for bus fare, and every expenditure had to be recorded in a special notebook if he gave her money for groceries. The only small relief was that Carlos increasingly preferred to shop for groceries himself. Julia didn't argue anymore. But since Carlos took over the shopping, their meals became more monotonous and of lower quality. At least her husband was calm, and Rosa no longer harped on about the need to save money. Julia noticed that Rosa was also a little afraid of her son. When there was no reason for conflict, Carlos was a wonderful husband and a passionate lover. He made sure Julia was warm and comfortable, gave her little presents, and paid her compliments. Her co-workers would look at her enviously. "Your Carlos is a real gem. How lucky you are to have snagged him," they would exclaim. And Julia couldn't say otherwise. After all, what else could she call it but luck? A city man, no ex-wives, no kids, no debts, hardworking, no bad habits, a true jackpot. The only shadow was his mother's constant presence, but Julia had gotten used to Rosa's difficult nature and knew exactly what to say and do to keep her in a good mood. Julia's marriage also provoked a lot of envy among her old acquaintances from her hometown. Maintaining real friendships wasn't possible anymore, but they still messaged each other on social media, and the news Julia received was always much the same. Marina divorced hers because he beat her, even knocked out a tooth. Can you imagine? One of Julia's old friends wrote. And all because he suspected her of having an affair with Rafael, the combine driver. Though honestly, he's no saint himself, a real womanizer. Other girls complained they were scraping by, raising kids on their own because their husbands not only didn't work but drank like there was no tomorrow. And when Julia replied that she had never seen her husband drunk, they simply didn't believe her. A normal man can't not drink. You should check, maybe he's secretly in rehab or has a stomach ulcer, one former classmate advised. You're telling me he never drinks? Not even on holidays? He doesn't drink at all, Julia would answer proudly. Maybe because he's a driver? You should see how careful he is on the road. He never breaks the rules and won't touch alcohol, no matter the occasion. And even when he's on vacation or it's a weekend, he doesn't drink? Julia could hear the envy in the voice message. The other girls complained that their men constantly looked at other women, and it took a lot of effort to keep them from cheating. Julia, however, was sure Carlos wasn't interested in anyone else. He always hurried home right after work. And now that he had taken on the heavy responsibility of grocery shopping for the family, Julia felt she should put him on a pedestal and honor him accordingly. Even her parents no longer criticized her husband, although they barely spoke, and communication was rare and fragmented. Carlos made sure his wife had minimal contact with her authoritarian father. "Sweetheart, why poison your soul?" he said. "You told me yourself that he's not a man but a real monster. Just tell your dad that your husband forbids you from calling your parents. Blame it all on me. I'll survive it for your peace of mind, believe me." Julia laughed at first but then caught herself thinking, jokes aside, it was Carlos who forbade her so much of what she wanted, supposedly for her own good. A nagging sense of unease gnawed at her. Since childhood, she'd been told that it was a husband's duty to care for and protect his wife. So why did Carlos's embraces sometimes feel like a vice? If Julia ever felt dissatisfied, she would scold herself. How could she be angry at such a golden man? What more could she want, silly girl? He was caring, kind, worked hard for her, and tried his best, and yet she sometimes brooded against him. After such thoughts, she would become especially affectionate with Carlos to compensate for what she saw as a lack of love on her part. A few months later, as summer warmth approached, Rosa called Julia in for a serious talk. "Tell me, dear, why haven't you blessed my son with a child yet? Carlos is already a grown man, and I think it's high time he had a baby to dote on." "I don't know why it hasn't happened," Julia shrugged honestly. "We just haven't really thought about it yet." "It's a woman's duty to handle such matters," Rosa said pointedly. "Carlos already has enough on his mind, like feeding you and making sure you're comfortable and happy. So please take care of it. I'd really like to have a grandchild before I die." Julia was used to taking Rosa's words as direct orders. A few days later, finding a gap in her busy schedule, she went to the local women's clinic. "I can't tell you anything good or bad," the tired, middle-aged doctor said, pulling off her disposable gloves and telling Julia to get dressed. "We'll see what your test results say. From the exam and the ultrasound, everything looks fine." "So, I can get pregnant?" Juliet asked timidly. "You can do whatever you want," the doctor mumbled without looking up from Julia's file. "But if you don't conceive within a year, come back for another checkup." That answer didn't satisfy Julia at all. What was she supposed to tell Carlos? That they had to try for another 6 months before even thinking about seeing a doctor again? Rosa had made it clear she wouldn't tolerate a grandchildless family, and Julia didn't want to be blamed for any delays. She slowly walked home, deciding not to take the bus. It was only a 20-minute walk. Julia needed to calm herself and tidy her thoughts, and Carlos wouldn't be home for a while. He had a trip out of town and would only be back late. She drifted into a daydream. Maybe in a year they would have a little one. Would it be a boy or a girl? The sudden ringing of her phone jolted her out of her reverie. It was her mother, never a good sign. Haltingly, with tears in her voice, her mother explained that Julia's father had suffered a heart attack 2 hours ago and had been taken to the city hospital. "Please, sweetheart, if you can, go visit your father," her mother pleaded. "You know how our buses don't run every day, and I can't always get there. Maybe he needs something brought to him. We're really counting on you, Julia." Julia wasn't ready to lose her father. As a teenager, she'd sometimes thought she hated him for being a tyrant, but to lose him like this, so soon, it was unthinkable. She glanced at her watch. If the ambulance had taken him 2 hours ago, he should already be at the regional hospital. She decided instantly. Julia crossed the road, got on a bus, and headed to where her father was waiting. She called Carlos several times to tell him she'd be late, but he didn't answer. Sometimes that happened when he was working. Julia was too worried about her father to pay it much mind. Luckily, the doctors reassured her when she arrived. Her father's condition was still unstable, but the prognosis was optimistic. "It happens," the doctors said. "Try not to upset him. With proper treatment, he'll recover quickly." Julia stayed at the hospital for several hours, first waiting outside the ward for an update, then running to the pharmacy with a list of medications. She completely forgot to charge her phone, and it died on the way home. When she finally walked through the door, Rosa flew out of the kitchen and immediately pounced on her. "Where have you been, you tramp? Carlos has been home for ages, and the table's empty, no dinner, because you've been out God knows where. Looking for some fun already? Barely half a year married, and you're already sniffing around for a new man?" "I can explain, Rosa." Julia raised her hands defensively. But at that moment, Carlos stormed out of the living room. "What did I tell you? You're my wife. You're supposed to be home waiting for me, not running around with lovers." He was shouting so loudly that Julia was terrified. "First I went to the women's clinic," Julia tried to explain, tripping over her words, "and then my father had a heart attack, and I went to the hospital." "We know what kind of father you were visiting," Rosa sneered, disappearing into her room. "Found yourself a nice man at the clinic, didn't you? That's why you went there." Julia looked at Carlos, pleading silently for him to believe her, to let her explain. "Carlos, my father's in the hospital. I really couldn't come home earlier. I called you several times, but you didn't answer. If you want, we can go visit him together." Instead of answering, Carlos raised his hand, and Julia's right cheek burned as if it had been set on fire. Her head jerked back on her slender neck, and she nearly fell. "Carlos," she cried, pressing her hand to her cheek. "Keep screaming, and you'll get more." Carlos grabbed her by the shoulders and began shaking her. "I told you, after work, you come straight home." "I did go to the women's clinic," Julia sobbed. She didn't want to cry, but the tears streamed down her cheeks uncontrollably. "And then my mom called and said that Dad, she said that Dad." "Don't lie to me, you filthy tramp." Another slap, this time to her left cheek, and Julia's head snapped back so violently that she crashed against the doorframe. "Carlos, what are you doing?" Julia cried out in horror. Until that moment, her husband had never laid a hand on her, and she couldn't have imagined that Carlos was capable of such cruelty. "If you don't shut up right now, I'll strangle you, you hear?" Carlos's lips twisted into a vile smile, his face flushed dark red. Angry crimson blotches spread across his cheeks, the muscles in his jaw clenched, and Julia quickly nodded. Arguing with a man in this state was dangerous. Carlos stepped back, watching with satisfaction the results of his lesson. "If I ever come home again and you're not here, and your phone is off, you'll have no one to blame but yourself," he said sharply. "I love you, and I married you to build a strong family, not to chase my wife out of strange men's beds or clinics. We know what kind of consultations you tramps get." "But I swear, Julia began, but she was terrified to finish, afraid another slap would follow. Yet she couldn't stay silent. Why did Carlos think so badly of her? "Listen to me one more time." Carlos leaned in close again, and Julia realized she shouldn't have tried to defend herself. "I don't care what you were doing. Next time, when I come home, you'll be running to meet me with a smile, and there better be a good dinner on the table. Got it?" That evening was unlike any other. Rosa and her son laughed and joked at the table, while Julia felt like she was drowning. Her head throbbed painfully from the blows Carlos had generously delivered. Needless to say, Carlos didn't consider Julia's father being in the hospital a good enough reason to visit him. He refused to go himself and forbade Julia from going as well. "You married me, which means you live with me. No need to be running around to hospitals," he said coldly. "If your mother wants to visit him, let her go herself." From his tone, Julia understood it was useless to argue or insist. Besides, did she really want to go, if she knew she wouldn't get any real support there, just more problems with her husband? Her father had received her coolly that day, so with a heavy heart, Julia agreed to Carlos's terms. If Carlos hadn't reacted so harshly, she might have wanted to visit her father, but now life went back to its usual routine. Luckily, Julia's father was strong enough to recover and was discharged after 10 days. If he and her mother resented Julia's distant attitude, they said nothing. Communication remained shallow and infrequent, much to Carlos's open satisfaction. His relationship with Julia smoothed out again as if that ugly episode had never happened. "I'm sorry, my love," Carlos whispered, showering Julia's face and neck with kisses, excusing his behavior that night. "I was just so worried. I'll never hit you again, but please, don't make me jealous and anxious. I'm trying so hard to be a good husband. I do everything for you, why do you disregard all my efforts?" "Darling, I tried to call you," Julia whispered, barely audible, afraid this peaceful moment might vanish. "You shouldn't have gone anywhere without me," Carlos said, gripping her wrist tightly with one hand and sliding the other over her body. "You're my wife. If you need to go somewhere, we go together. We're a family, understand?" "I understand, my love. I'll do just that." Julia didn't argue. She realized she had to agree. Then, in early August, Julia sensed something had changed. She was pregnant. She felt it even before taking a test, intuitively, deep down. She didn't want to tell Carlos prematurely. Instead, she bought a pregnancy test when she found a free moment, and there it was, 2 bright red lines. Since both Rosa and Carlos had hinted several times that she should get treated for infertility, Julia wanted to present the news with grandeur. In her dreams, she imagined herself joyful, glowing, certain that Carlos would be thrilled to become a father. Dreaming of the happy days ahead, Julia closed her eyes and drifted off on the couch. When she woke up, dusk had already fallen outside. She quickly tied back her hair and rushed to the kitchen. Rosa had gone to visit an old friend, and Carlos was due home any minute. She couldn't let him come back to an empty table. But she didn't make it in time. She had to apologize profusely and promise that dinner would be ready soon, asking him to shower and rest in the meantime. "How does this keep happening?" Carlos grumbled. I understand delays, but you get home much earlier than I do. Didn't my mother teach you that a wife should love her husband? I love you very much, Carlos, Julia said, feeling so happy that even his nagging words didn't hurt her now. And I have something to tell you, we're going to have a baby. What are we going to have? Carlos asked, frowning. I don't know yet, maybe a boy, maybe a girl. The important thing is, I'm pregnant. But instead of the joy she had imagined, Carlos didn't show the slightest hint of happiness. And what are you planning to do about it? He muttered under his breath. Julia immediately noticed the shift in his mood, and all the joy vanished, as if it had never existed. I'll register at the clinic and follow all the doctor's orders, she mumbled, eyes downcast. Carlos looked at her intently and said, When you go to that clinic, take my mother with you. Why? Julia was stunned by such a demand. I can handle it myself, it's not complicated. But she immediately regretted saying it. How could she forget? She shouldn't speak out of turn with Carlos, he twisted everything to his own meaning. So my mother's right, you're only going to that clinic to spread your legs for men, he roared. A decent woman wouldn't go there unless she absolutely had to. Julia stared at him, wide-eyed with shock. Darling, last time I saw a woman doctor. I'm sure it'll be the same this time. To make sure it is, you'll take my mother, Carlos barked, leaning menacingly toward her. He didn't say a word about being happy to become a father. Julia stared at Carlos, and deep down, doubts began to fester. Just that morning, everything between them had been wonderful. They couldn't stop kissing before leaving for work. Carlos seemed the embodiment of all manly virtues, strong, smart, brave, caring. She had hoped that telling him about the pregnancy would mark a new chapter in their life together, without blame, without problems. But now it seemed like there would be even more issues. And it wasn't her fault. When Rosa came home from visiting her friend, she too showed no great joy at the news of a future grandchild. Carlos, you really need to sort out the housing situation, she said to her son. First, there's not enough space here. Second, I need peace and quiet, and a crying baby won't give me that. Mama. For the first time, Julia saw Carlos angry, not at her, but at his mother. What am I supposed to do? Carlos said sharply. Where am I going to get money for an apartment? You think I just printed or something? All right, don't get worked up, Rosa soothed, patting Carlos's arm to calm him down. Then at least make sure your wife is ready for the baby's arrival. Teach her how to take care of it so it doesn't cry and behaves properly. Julia could hardly imagine a newborn trained not to cry just because someone taught it so. Her rosy dreams quickly evaporated from her curly head, and she realized she was in deep trouble. Before, she was only responsible for herself and still struggled through life. Now it was going to be 100 times worse. Deep down, Julia hoped her parents would congratulate her on the news of the upcoming baby. But disappointment awaited her there too. Her father merely advised her to remember that she was a married woman and to guard the family hearth. There would be nowhere to return to, especially not with a child. Her mother, not daring to go against her husband as usual, simply reminded Julia she was responsible for her own life. From the very beginning of her pregnancy, Julia understood she could count only on herself and Carlos, and guessing his mood was impossible. Sure, Carlos was trying his best to be kind, gentle, and patient. In fact, he even seemed more considerate now. But Julia worried, once the baby was born, conflicts would surely arise. Babies are loud, and Rosa had already made it clear she wouldn't tolerate noise, only peace and quiet. Julia went to the women's clinic practically under guard. Mostly Rosa accompanied her, and occasionally Carlos himself, the proud future father. For them, these visits were almost a celebration. For Julia, they felt like being marched under armed escort. One day, when Carlos was in an unusually good mood and cuddling her tenderly, Julia dared to ask, "Darling, why are you so worried and won't even let me go to the doctor alone? Haven't I proven you can trust me? It's not like I'm heading to the North Pole." The cheerfulness vanished from Carlos's eyes in an instant. He shot her a cold, sharp look and said, "And you think I should just let things slide? That's how today's youth think, free love and all that. One day they want a home and a baby with their husband, the next they're off God knows where. Julia hurried to assure Carlos she never even thought of being unfaithful. "You're my first and only man. I only want to be with you," she whispered fervently into his ear. "Then you shouldn't have any problem with me going with you," Carlos replied. A normal woman would be grateful. Julia didn't bother explaining that his care felt suffocating. It's one thing to happily plan outings together, another to have every clinic visit strictly supervised by Carlos and Rosa to avoid a scandal. Since Carlos had helped her get the job, he made sure Julia switched to part-time work. "Your pennies don't really make a difference in the family budget anyway. Better that I know you're at home, warm and safe." "Your husband is looking after you," Rosa chimed in, though no one had asked for her opinion. "You're lucky to have Carlos." Julia genuinely thought she was lucky. The initial fear of pregnancy had faded, she had grown used to her condition and looked to the future with more optimism. Life was slowly getting better. Whether it was because Carlos truly wanted the child or was moved by her state, he had become gentler. The total control remained, but Julia felt freer otherwise. She even started getting little gifts from Carlos, small but pleasant, and Julia, unaccustomed to such attention, appreciated them deeply. At first, Rosa grumbled about Carlos becoming sentimental and wasteful, but then she conceded. "Maybe you're doing the right thing, Carlos. Let your wife appreciate it. Not many men these days marry and then shower their wives with gifts." But the storm broke suddenly during one of Julia's clinic visits for routine tests. At the reception desk, she was informed that her regular doctor was on sick leave, but she could see another physician. "Dr. Fernando will gladly see you," they said. Julia froze in place. Carlos, standing behind her, grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the exit. "No need for you to see a man," Carlos growled darkly. Julia couldn't believe what she was hearing. It wasn't the Middle Ages, after all. "Darling, I have an appointment. I need to be examined." But instead of the understanding she had gotten used to in recent months, she saw Carlos transform into that terrifying figure again. "I said, we're leaving," Carlos hissed in her ear. "Don't make me teach you a lesson in front of everyone." Maybe someone else would have brushed it off, but Julia knew what such threats meant. Carlos would punish her for disobedience. "Look at you, completely shameless," Carlos muttered as he shoved her into the car and tore off from the curb. "Eyeing other men, huh? Good thing I never trusted you. You'd be betting half the city by now." Julia sat in silence, terrified and heartbroken. Had the peaceful, happy life they'd recently built been just an illusion? She thought Carlos had changed, preparing himself to be a father, revising his principles. Clearly, she had been wrong. At home, Carlos calmed down but didn't change his decision. There would be no male gynecologists for his wife, period. Even Rosa didn't openly support her son, perhaps she was wary of his sudden aggression. Still, she didn't encourage Julia either, staying on the sidelines to avoid becoming the target of her son's anger. Julia didn't know then that her life was about to change drastically in just a few days. After that failed clinic visit, she got a call from work, asking her to come in urgently. Her test results had worried the doctor. Hearing the dreaded word inflammation, Julia rushed to the clinic during her lunch break, unable to reach Carlos by phone, not that she dared to insist when he was busy. At the clinic, the doctor advised her, "We're referring you to a nephrologist. Your test results are very concerning. You might need hospitalization. But don't cry, bad tests aren't the end of the world. Just don't let this go untreated, or you risk losing the baby." When Carlos finally called her back and asked where she was, Julia, not thinking twice, told him the truth. She was at the clinic, and her situation was serious. "And you went there without me?" Carlos roared into the phone. "Great wife I've got. You know what men say about women like you? Easy." If Julia hadn't been so worried about her health and her baby, she might have, out of habit, responded calmly to smooth things over. But now, the future mother had no energy left for that. The way you name a ship, that's how it'll sail. Julia snapped into the phone and headed for the bus stop. A strange, unfamiliar anger was rising inside her. How much longer was she supposed to endure the mockery and intimidation? She had done absolutely nothing to make Carlos suspect her of infidelity. Tonight she would have a serious talk with him. Even Rosa's eternal defense of her son wouldn't help him this time. Julia herself didn't know where this sudden courage came from, but she felt a desire, a power, as if she could move mountains. She managed to change into something comfortable at home and splashed cold water on her face to pull herself together. As she was about to call the doctor to make an appointment, the doorbell rang. She hadn't even reached the door when it began to shake from heavy blows. "Open up, you whore." "I know you're in there," Carlos shouted from outside the door, his voice filled with fury. "Open the door, slut. Locked yourself in with your lover? I'll show you what happens to women who sleep around." Carlos was yelling so loudly that Julia instinctively wanted to cover her ears. It was disgusting and embarrassing, especially knowing the neighbors, whom she had befriended, could hear everything. "Open up, Julia," came Rosa's voice from behind the door. "Open up, or we'll come in and find your lover ourselves. Hurry up." Julia, hesitating in the hallway, decisively turned the lock. At that very moment, the door flung open. Carlos, not expecting it to be unlocked, had hit it so hard that it slammed against the wall. "Well, slut, where's your man?" Carlos stood there, familiar and yet unrecognizable. His bloodshot eyes, clenched fists, and bulging veins made him look terrifying. Rosa quickly scanned the apartment, shot a glance at Julia, and, seemingly realizing something, grabbed her son's arm. "Carlos, sweetie, let's calm down, please. Listen to your mother, don't do anything stupid, son." But Carlos was beyond reason. Roaring like a wounded bull, he lunged at Julia. In the cramped hallway, there was nowhere to run. He slapped her across the face, harshly, as he had that long-forgotten day. Everything happened so fast that Julia didn't even have time to shield herself or escape. Seeing her frozen, Carlos became even more enraged and suddenly punched her hard in the stomach. "Take that, bitch. Now you'll know better than to make bastards with other men. Remember me for the rest of your life, I swear." Julia clearly smelled alcohol on Carlos. For the first time since she'd known him, he was drunk. That was the last thing she remembered. She slowly collapsed onto the floor, feeling a searing pain in her lower belly, spreading and engulfing her whole being. She whimpered softly, scratching the dirty linoleum with her nails. Rosa leaned over her, saying something to Carlos, but Julia could no longer understand anything. She closed her eyes, and merciful unconsciousness saved her from the pain. Julia regained consciousness in the gynecology ward of the local perinatal center. A young nurse stood awkwardly beside her and, after several tries, managed to inform her that the baby couldn't be saved. Julia already knew it somehow. She lay alone in a two-bedroom, staring at the peeling green paint on the wall. Inside, she felt as cold as a winter field at night. Carlos had done the one thing she feared the most. He had shattered her from the inside. Carlos was nowhere to be seen or heard, but the next day Rosa showed up, uninvited. Julia expected her to act brazen and rude, but instead, Rosa looked hollow, even guilty. "Forgive me, child," Rosa said unexpectedly warmly. "I didn't think you would become so savage. You don't know the whole story, Julia." She placed her hand over Julia's, the first time she had ever acknowledged her as an equal. Carlos was a difficult child, born with complications. The doctors said it was oxygen deprivation or something like that. He was late to walk, late to talk, and later, he started having violent outbursts. I didn't know where to hide from him. Julia wanted to block out Rosa's voice, but there was no escape. He could hit me so hard that the bruises would last for weeks. He fought at school too, and was even registered with the juvenile authorities. They didn't even take him into the army, too dangerous, they said, too risky to give him a weapon. He eventually became a driver, and that was a good fit. Drivers aren't supposed to drink, and he loses control when he drinks. Julia turned away, uninterested in Carlos' life story, but Rosa kept talking. He was 25 when he fell in love. He was obsessed with the girl, Paulina. She liked him at first but left after he hit her once during a fight. He couldn't let it go. She found someone new, and Carlos convinced himself she cheated on him. What happened next? It was ugly. Carlos is strong. The guy she was with didn't stand a chance. There was a police investigation, but somehow it got swept under the rug. After that, he lived quietly until he met you. I thought everything would be fine. I have nothing against you. I just wanted things to be good for Carlos, and if he was happy, you would be too. Rosa sighed. He just drank a bit. It was some kind of celebration, and then you and your clinic, it all got into his drunken head. You can't kill him over this, right? You'll make up, get over it, and go back to living your life. Julia barely managed to part her dry, cracked lips and whispered one word. Out. Rosa understood immediately, cast one last guilty glance at Julia, and shuffled out of the room. Just yesterday, Rosa had been a confident woman. Now she looked bent under the weight of her burdens. Julia knew Rosa wouldn't punish her son. Carlos would have to answer for everything, for the miscarriage, too. Julia had no one to turn to, nowhere to go. In the city, no one was waiting for her. After everything that had happened, she had to leave her job, and she had neither the strength nor money to find a new apartment. Carlos, meanwhile, had returned to his old charming self, waiting for her with flowers at her workplace entrance, begging forgiveness, promising he would see a psychiatrist. Rosa kept calling and sending messages begging Julia to withdraw the police report, insisting Carlos had changed. But Julia only smiled bitterly and blocked every number. Carlos would answer for everything. When her sick leave money, which she had used to rent a tiny room, ran out, Julia had to do what she swore she never would. Trembling, she went to the bus station and bought a ticket back to her hometown. She knew her father might throw her out, but there was no other choice, better that than sleeping on the street and risking Carlos finding and killing her. She opened the door of her childhood home with hesitation. She remembered her father's warnings at her wedding and knew she wouldn't find much welcome here. The house met her with strange silence. Julia looked around. No one was there. Odd, her mother hadn't mentioned going anywhere. The front door opened quietly, and Julia sensed more than heard someone standing behind her. She turned and saw her father in the doorway, tall, massive, like a monument. Her father had always seemed to the girl as if he had been carved out of stone. He looked at her, and his paternal gaze promised nothing good. "Papa, I won't be long," Julia stammered, frightened even by the sound of her own voice. "Something just happened." "Papa, it's just for a little while, a week or two." Her father said nothing and stepped into the house. He crossed the room, leaning forward, fists clenched, and Julia instinctively shrank back from him. Had she jumped from the frying pan into the fire? Was it going to be the same here too? The next moment, Julia realized it was hard to breathe, even her ribs seemed to creak. Her father squeezed her in an embrace so tight she gasped for air. "My little girl, what did he do to you?" "No, don't speak, don't say anything yet. I'll find a way. I'll skin that bastard alive, Julia, I promise you." "What did he do to you?" Julia wanted to reply but couldn't. She was too scared to move, too scared that the magic of the moment would shatter if she said even a single careless word. Had her father, whose reaction she had feared so much, really said that? Had he, instead of throwing her out, actually shown her compassion? Julia started to cry, but now the tears were not of despair, rather, they were tears of relief, flowing down her cheeks. "It's all right, Papa," she said, surprised herself at how gentle and tender her voice sounded. "It's all fine now. But you'll have to tell me everything. I understand you didn't come here from a good life, showing up alone and with bags," her father continued, and from his voice, Julia could tell he was close to tears too. "I'll tell you everything, every detail," Julia said, finally catching her breath. Though in fact, she had no intention of keeping that promise. A new confidence had been born and solidified inside her, that her father would leave nothing but horns and hooves of Carlos if he ever found out. Unnoticed, her mother had entered the house. She stood in the doorway, watching as her husband, once hard and uncompromising, held their fragile, sensitive daughter tightly in his arms. How alike they were, those curls, those expressions, that look. Since his illness, her husband had become much softer, especially towards their daughter. But Julia didn't know that. He had been too awkward to find a way to reconnect with his now fully grown daughter. He feared that after everything that had happened between them, Julia wouldn't even want to know him, so he hid his true feelings behind a facade of sternness. Yet his paternal heart told him his daughter needed him badly, and he knew he had to act. So he waited, just waited. He often asked his wife whether she was sure that if Julia ever needed help, their girl would come home. Or maybe, he suggested, he should go to the capital and preemptively yank the legs off that cunning son-in-law. What if Carlos was hurting Julia, and she was too afraid or ashamed to ask for help? Maybe he should pay Rosa a visit too, make it clear that if a single hair fell from their daughter's head, he'd rip out every strand of her dyed mop. "What is it with you and all this yanking and ripping?" his wife would laugh. "Maybe everything is fine for our Julia, a happy marriage, a kind mother-in-law, and all that. I'm sure our girl knows that there's no one closer or dearer to her in this world than us. And if Julia needs help, she'll come. Everything will be fine."
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.